Hello, today I'm going to share 5 different stitches for pine needle basketry that will add texture and beauty to your basket projects. Hey there, my name is Brittany. Welcome to Basket Weaving with Textile Indie. I'm a basket weaver and fiber artist, and I work in rattan baskets, pine needle basketry, and other materials. And I'm excited to share these 5 stitches that will elevate your pine needle basket coiling projects. These stitches I'm going to cover are the whip stitch, the V-stitch, an alternate V-stitch, the wheat stitch, and the fern stitch. All of these build on each other, so watch through the video so that you can progress through the different stitches. The whip stitch is your foundational stitch and it builds up to the fern stitch. I'm working with Ponderosa pine needles, a waxed polyester braided thread, a number 20 tapestry needle. It's slightly blunted on the end so I don't stab myself, and a gauge. This is, actually I don't know what this is, but I usually use a plastic straw that I've just cut a bit off of. This I think is an electrical piece that I happen to have in my stash, but I'm not sure where that came from. I will be showing the fern stitch with raffia because the thicker material shows up nicely with that stitch. You will definitely want to try the wheat stitch with the raffia as well, but I'm going to do it in the waxed twine just to show you what it would look like and how to do it. Raffia does add really fun texture to your basket, so if you want to try that, go for it. I would say if you're first starting out in pine needle basketry, go for a wax linen or a wax polyester thread. It's a little bit easier to work with. You won't have to add as many pieces as you work. The raffia that I'm working with isn't quite 4 feet long, which means that I'm adding more regularly, and that slows down your stitching process, and it does sometimes crack and split. I've gathered and cleaned my pine needles and stripped the ends off. You can watch this video on how to prepare your pine needles so that you're ready to start your basket weaving projects. From there, we're going to dive into these stitches. I am going to show in my next video how to start a base around a wooden round that you've put holes into, so come back next week for that video as well as more basket weaving and rattan basketry projects. The first stitch I want to show you is the whip stitch. It's the fundamental stitch for pine needle baskets, and the way to do it is to wrap the thread tightly around the coils and pass your needle through the coil in the middle. You'll keep your stitches close and even. I go for about 1/4 inch apart, and you can add stitches as you need to as your circle gets bigger or the size of the basket grows. This is a great stitch to work in the foundation of baskets or the bottom of baskets, and if you work it up the sides, like in these examples, as I started to build up the walls of the basket, you can see that they create a coil shape or a sunray effect around the basket as they work up, and you will have them connect to create these spirals in both the inside and the outside of the basket if you place your needle correctly. In this example, I placed my needle correctly on one side, but you can see on the inside the stitches are disconnected, and so it's not as neat and tidy in the bottom here. I fixed that as I was working up the walls for this one, and now I have the nice sunray spirals up here on the inside and the outside of the walls. So to do the whip stitch, you're going to load your thread and your needle. I'm showing you mid-process. I will have a video on how to start a pine needle basket with a wooden center here in a few weeks, so be sure to subscribe to get notified when that comes out. So what you'll do is we're going to stitch using the previous round of stitches as a guide. So I'm going to take my number 20 tapestry needle and my waxed polyester thread. I'm going to take the needle and send this through the middle of the coil from one side of the coil, and I'm going in on the right side of the stitch, and I'm going to angle my needle so I go to the middle of the coil on the other side, but to the left of the stitch over here. So I went in on the right of the stitch, coming out on the left of the stitch. I'm going to pull this through and pull tight, and this will pull that coil right next to the previous coil, and the stitches connect a bit so that you get that angled spiral effect. So then from underneath where my thread's coming out, I'm going to lift this up and over to the side I'm looking at. Again, place my needle on the right side of the next stitch, come out on the left side in the middle of the coil, the same stitch. So I'm just crossing over like that, and then pull through. And position your stitch and then pull tight. Now I'm going to load more pine needles. Again, make sure your tension is nice and tight. You pull on that stitch. You don't want it to loosen because the pine needles will shrink a little bit as they dry, which will make your basket loose and wobbly if you didn't pull your stitches nice and tight. Pull tight, bring it back to the top, into the next stitch. In the middle of the coil on the right side of the stitch, out on the left side of the stitch. Pull tight, bring this around, move your gauge up a little bit, in on the right side of the stitch, out to the left side of the stitch. Pull through. And you'll continue doing this around and around as you build up the walls of your basket. Now, if your spacing exceeds a 1/4 inch in consistency around your basket, so if all the spaces are over a 1/4 inch, then I would do a stitch in between. I'll just demonstrate, I'm not there yet, but you would come in and between 2 stitches, you would send your needle through the pine needles, like so, pull through, and you'll have created a stitch in between stitches to start to increase or decrease the space and increase the stitches. And that is the whip stitch, creating that sunray or spiral effect in the stitching, like in this basket. The next stitch I'm going to show you is the V stitch, which creates this subtle V shape in the surface of the basket. This is essentially creating 2 stitches in one, so it's a really nice visual addition. It does take double the amount of stitching time, so consider that as you're weaving your basket. So to do the V stitch, I have my little sampler started here. I've started in the whip stitch, which we learned in the last segment. Now I'm going to begin doing some V stitches. So what I'll be doing is creating a stitch into the previous stitch as if we're doing a whip stitch. So in on the right side of the stitch, out on the left side of the stitch, pull through, and then we're going to do the same thing, creating a second stitch in the same hole. So in on the right, out on the left, following that same hole we just created, and pull through. And now we'll separate that second leg of our V out a little bit, pull tight, and then we'll move our gauge and move to the next stitch. So we're still going in on the right, out on the left, pull a stitch through, and then do a second stitch in that same space. And pull through, spacing that second leg of the stitch out a little bit. Into the next stitch, in on the right, out on the left, pull through, and around, back into that same hole, pull through. Now you'll do these V stitches all the way around into your previous stitches, and then I'll show you how to stitch the next round into the V stitch itself. When you've come back around and you've done one round of the V stitches, these little V's right here, then you're ready to start doing V stitches in previous V stitches. So here, what you're going to do to create this texture where the V stitches build on each other and you kind of mimic the spiral pattern that we had with the whip stitch, like this, that kind of spiral look. What we're going to do is put the stitch into the second leg of our V stitch. So we have two little legs for our V stitch here. We have this guy and this guy. We're going to come in and put our next stitch in beside the second leg of the V. So in on the right, out on the left, in that second leg, pull through, pull tight, and then loop around and do a second stitch in that same hole. Like so. So you're building on top of that previous V stitch. So the next one over, in on the right of that second leg of the V-stitch, out on the left, pull tight, so you'll continue stitching around, stitching into that second leg or the furthest part of the V, looping your thread to the front, coming into the middle on the right and out to the middle on the left of that same stitch. Make sure you're following that same stitch through the coil. Now with this thread, because it's so thin, you will want to space these out wider so they don't get smashed together like this one here. You want them to spread out, so make sure to pull tight with the legs of the V wide. As you grow the basket, you will want to insert stitches between stitches to make sure that you're not spacing your stitches too far apart. So you would create a V in that space like normal, but into the pine needles rather than a previous stitch. So I'd come in here, just right through the pine needles, create my V, just 2 stitches into the same hole, and then move on to the next stitch. This is likely going to happen if you grow a round base out fairly wide, or if you're working in an oval, the 2 ends, you'll need to be adding stitches. This is more oval shape, so the stitches on the ends are spaced further apart than they are on the sides here. And you can continue working in this V-stitch for the entirety of your basket, or just add a section as a unique texture. It's up to you how you play around with adding the V-stitch into your basket. It is structurally sound and adds nice stability and strength because of the double stitch. So it works well as a foundation stitch, not just a decorative stitch. That is the V-stitch. The next stitch we have is an alternative to the V-stitch. This is the V-stitch, but putting the stitch in the first leg of the V rather than the second leg. To do this stitch, we're going to come in and find our V-stitch, so this stitch right here. On this first leg, I'm going to do my stitch. I'm going to send this through, going in on the right, out on the left, pull through, pull tight, and then put a second stitch in that same space, same hole. Like so. And again, into the next V-stitch right here, I'm going to go in on the right of that first leg of the stitch, and then come out on the left of that same stitch. Pull through, pull tight, and then another stitch in the same hole. So you're still getting that V shape, but the overall look of the stitches is different. So this one I think more of like a vine where you have little leaves popping off. The second leg of the V almost looks like little leaves. So that spiral is still happening around the base, but you have little lines coming off of it. So you can see, compare the two here. You have V's built into the second leg. They kind of stack on top of each other and spiral, and then you have V's built into the first leg and they spiral, but they have one leg hanging off by itself, creating little leaf-like texture. That is the alternate V-stitch. The next stitch I want to show you is the wheat stitch, and this is worked in a thicker thread or twine. I'm using a piece of raffia here. You're going to work around so that you have one round of plain stitches, and then work a round of V stitches by doing a split stitch. So you're going to split the previous stitch with your V stitch, and I'll show you that in just a minute while I get this second leg of this V-stitch. So there's my V-stitch here. What you'll do is when you loop around, you're going to come to your next stitch and put your needle through that previous stitch. So it's puncturing right through that stitch. And on the other side, come through the stitch material as well. Pull through, pull tight, and then do the second leg of your stitch. And you're going to do a round of these V-stitches all the way around into the previous row of stitches. When you've gone all the way around with your V-stitches, it might look like you did a round of V-stitches previously because your round may have split. These were all single whip stitches, but they split when I did the stitch through them. So now they look like V-stitches. So now we're going to do the wheat stitch round. So to do our wheat stitch, we're going to come into the second leg of our previous V-stitch, split that stitch in two, straight through to the other side. So we're going right through the middle of it, through to the other side. Do our first leg of a V-stitch, and then come into that same hole and do the second leg of a V-stitch, making sure to go through that same space. And then we'll cross over to the second leg of the next stitch, split that stitch in half, go through the coil, pull through, and then do the second leg of a V-stitch here. You'll continue working around, working your stitches into the second leg of that previous row, but rather than going to the side like we did in the V-stitch and the alternate V-stitch, we're going straight through it. So we're splitting the stitch like this to create our new stitch. So splitting, straight through. And this is more visually appealing when you do it with a thick thread because it's more visible. And it's especially cool looking with the raffia because the raffia splits so much that as you're working, these stitches will spread out and it'll almost look like the fern stitch, which is going to be the next stitch I go over. But rather than doing 3 legs, we're actually only doing 2, but because of the split material, it looks like we have 3 legs here. So the wheat stitch can be worked as a rim stitch at the top of a basket or within the walls of a basket to add texture or visual appeal. Now I want to show you the fern stitch, which is a stitch that actually looks a lot better if you do it with raffia or a thicker or variegated size thread. I'm going to use this polyester thread because I think it's a little bit easier to see here on camera. But what you'll do is go around and you'll do a round of V stitches. So I've done V stitches into the previous row of whip stitches. And now I've done the first leg of my V stitch here. I'm back to where I started, so I'm to the beginning where I began V stitches. Now I'm going to go backwards, and instead of continuing this direction from left to right, I'm going to reverse, loop this to the front, and go back into the space here where these 2 previous V legs were sent through. Send this through, pull tight, and now I've just created a third leg for this V-stitch. So now I have 2 angled stitches and 1 stitch down the middle. I'll go back one more again, continuing to work right to left, go into the same hole as before, pull through, and I've created another leg to that stitch. So that is the fern stitch. Again, this looks a lot more intricate and decorative if it's done with a thicker piece of twine or a raffia. Now when you get back to the start here, I've just done a stitch into this. I'm going to pull this to the front and do a stitch to do the second leg of my V-stitch in this coil that I didn't quite finish. So I did half the V-stitch when I started. Now I'm going to finish off the V-stitch, and this carries the thread from the back of the work up over 2 coils. So over the coil to create the fern stitch back here, and then up here to the front to create the second leg of my V-stitch. So that is my first V-stitch of my next round. You're going to build the next round putting your needle into the second leg of the previous V-stitch. So we have 3 legs here. You want to go into the middle, to the right side of the middle leg, come out on the left side of the same middle leg, and then pull through, and you'll go back to doing V-stitches. Loop around. The fern stitch is a great stitch to do around the upper edge of a basket as the finishing stitch. You can also do this throughout the basket as an added motif or texture addition. So you continue around doing your V-stitches into that middle portion of the previous row, and then you'll reverse. Once you've gone all the way around, you'll reverse and do that third leg going backwards. This can also be called a back stitch because you're back stitching to get that third segment of the stitch. And that is your fern stitch. And that is how to do the whip stitch, the V-stitch, the alternate V-stitch, the wheat stitch, and the fern stitch. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a lot like it so that it gets spread to other basket weaving enthusiasts. I'd love for you to do that. Thank you so much. Subscribe so that you get notified whenever I put out a new video, and there are going to be more pine needle basket videos here on the channel. Until next time, check out this video for some more basket weaving inspiration and information, and happy weaving. See you next time. Bye.